In episode 29, I might have hinted at the Nintendo 64 never being that big a thing for me, so this second episode dedicated to the platform will likely be the last in my nostalgia trip games. So what more suitable spot to put it in than episode 64? Well, one of the more obvious choices to include when speaking of Nintendo 64 is the first sequel to Pilotwings, which started life on the Super Nintendo in 1990 and has only been revisited once since on 3DS in 2011. Pilotwings 64 was one of the first games released for the Nintendo 64, originally released as a launch title, much like the original was used as a launch title for the Super Nintendo in North America, and the last one for the 3DS in North America and Europe. Since the first game, Pilotwings has always been a good tech demo to display the 3D capabilities of each of the consoles they were released on, but it's also a solid game with hours of fun to be had. As with the other two Pilotwings games, you control a selectable pilot and try to earn pilot licenses through different aviation-related events, whether it's jetpacking, hang gliding, skydiving, or whatever. Pilotwings 64 also featured a mode in which you can free roam through the islands featured in the game, one of them being a condensed version of the United States of America. It's good, clean fun in a way only Nintendo was able to do in the 90s, and I highly recommend it. Because I have two North American region games in my N64 collection that I like to play but cannot be recorded with my equipment, those being Killer Instinct Gold and Star Wars Episode 1 Racer, the next two games take their place on this list. The first one is Body Harvest, developed by DMA Design and published in 1998 in Europe by Gremlin Interactive and in North America by Midway. If DMA Design doesn't sound too familiar to you, old folks might remember them from the Lemmings series, but they later became known as Rockstar North, the developers behind the Grand Theft Auto series. Body Harvest is an interesting one-off in their catalog, as it was intended to be a launch title for the Nintendo 64, but Nintendo, who were originally the intended publisher, considered it to be too violent, so they dropped the game, only to be snatched later on by Gremlin. Body Harvest tells a dystopian story of aliens invading Earth and harvesting most of its population during a 100-year period. The year is, as retro-futuristic as you might expect, 2016, and aliens have returned to harvest more people, so your job is to prevent them from doing their thing and travel around the world following the aliens' reported attack pattern. It's a mostly harmless game, although a bit difficult to get the hang of, but with Nintendo's quality control being what it is, it also became the last game DMA or Rockstar ever made for the big Nintendo consoles. An interesting piece of gaming history to be sure, and worth a look. One of the most infuriating games that I always wanted to like, and occasionally still go back to it despite my knowing better, is Nintendo's very own attempt at creating an extreme sports game, 1080 Snowboarding. I admit the main reason why I even have this game in my collection is because it was a cheap addition, but at least I have tried to give it some attention every now and then. 1080! Despite getting very good reviews, I've never been able to come to terms with how utterly clumsy the game is compared to, say, the Tony Hawk games, or even Ski or Die from over 10 years prior to this. but it does have a good amount of variables. There's a good bunch of selectable players, all with their own nationalities and abilities, of course, and there's a few different play modes as well, including a couple of different trick-based modes, 3 race modes, and a training mode.
Ready? Go!
From my personal experience, I can tell you that the training mode is definitely required here, because playing with your Tony Hawk skills just doesn't apply here. With some perseverance though, 1080 snowboarding just might get enjoyable in time, and it's a good game to have early on in your N64 game collection.
Oh, it's a new record!
If there's a genre that suffers from oversupply on the Nintendo 64, that would probably be racing games. All of the big ones are classics for good reasons, but I've grown the most fond of F-Zero X, released in 1998, probably because the series hasn't been continued since 2004. While the original F-Zero was driven on flat surfaces with some jump platforms, F-Zero X puts the N64's 3D graphics capabilities to full use with tracks with similar roller coasterish designs as in the Wipeout games. Come to think of it, the N64 did have its very own Wipeout game, Wipeout 64, the same year that F-Zero X came out, but that remains the only game in the series to make an appearance on a Nintendo console, so expanding the F-Zero franchise to more modern Nintendo platforms would not only be logical, but welcome. Well anyway, F-Zero X has 30 drivers to choose from, 30 different vehicles, 5 different game modes, 4 difficulty levels for each game mode, and 6 tracks for each game mode. With all this though, the game suffers from a lack of details, but it runs super fast and smooth, so I suppose it's better to have lots of content instead of somewhat prettier graphics. To be honest, my experiences with the Nintendo 64 are not so vast that I would have ever paid that much attention to the graphics, and in any case, gameplay is what matters, and F-Zero X has that in abundance. For some reason I was never that big a fan of Mario going 3D, so for me, Super Mario 64 was always a point where the franchise took a wrong turn, and has stayed on it ever since. In 2000, Nintendo released yet another strange detour in their Mario saga with a title called Paper Mario. My old gaming friend SJ, who had the Nintendo 64 back then, which I've since bought off from him, was very enthusiastic about this game, since he was also a big fan of the lesser-known Super Mario RPG from the Super Nintendo, and he introduced it to me. I thought the visual concept of having 2D elements in a 3D environment was a bit bonkers, so of course it caught my attention more instantly than the Super Mario 64 ever did. Paper Mario plays like a cross between a Final Fantasy game and a Super Mario game, with some minor influences from the Zelda series. For the adventuring parts, it is basically a side-scrolling platformer with some passages going depth-wise. You can enter buildings, have conversations, do some shopping, and save your game in designated buildings. If you engage in a battle with any hostile creature, the game turns into a turn-based battle in which you choose your fight moves or items to use. Obviously, at the end of each area, you will face a boss battle. Structurally, it is very much a Mario game, so for Mario fans it offers a nice change in playstyle, and for Final Fantasy fans it offers a more involving Mario experience. Paper Mario turned out to be such a success that it spawned its own series with 7 games released so far. Of course, being a Mario game, it's one of the necessary games to experience on a Nintendo console, but in the case of Nintendo 64, it's definitely my favorite.